All right, so presentation is here. I'm adding it to the stage. And yeah, so everyone, Lasha Antadze, founder of Rari Labs. Lasha, the stage is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, let me just make sure that I can change the slides. Okay, perfect. Now it works. Um, Hello, everyone, first of all, and let me let me start. Yeah, so when I was invited, and especially like always happy to talk to Ukrainian audience, so Slava Ukraine. Uh, Regarding my topic, so I've been working currently into a blockchain space for like 10 years, but the theme about the rebuild and the Ukraine and the future of governance that I'm going to talk about, it's very kind of natural of my previous years. And basically, what I've been doing the last 10 years, it's somehow connected with the civil tech and this very complex but magical world of cryptography that exists in the blockchains. So, a bit of a recap: 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to actually work in Ukraine for the reforms, and that was in 2015, 2017 era, post revolutionary Ukraine, where I was youngest guy, like thinking about like the positive changes that could be done. And I was lucky enough to work with some of the reformers back then. And one of the things that I worked was this public service hall Gotovo that still stands in near like Tseveka building in Kiev. Uh, and I was during the same period of time lucky and quite naive to build one of the blockchain related government projects. It was called Auction 3.0, which was launched as a trial, and we were helping back then Ukrainian government to conduct this kind of transparent privatization of the state assets. And it was one of the first things, from a technical perspective, from like collaboration perspective. And that's how these two worlds of my civil engagement and the blockchain started. What came out of it, I don't know, but what I'll be always proud of is that like one thing that 100% works in Kotova is the marriage center. So a lot of my friends and everyone I know from Kiev got married there, and that kind of like shows, right? So when you take the bureaucracy or like something that is like paper heavy but transform it into something beautiful and human, then it works for all these years. So in a way, that's my previous life and how I got here and to this point. But over this experience that I had working on government and especially Ukrainian bureaucracy early on, and I went through a lot of like joy, a lot of disappointment, a lot of resistance. But overall, what I learned, especially when you're trying to change something like fundamentally, whether it's like growth, rebuild, or something, change is possible. It's always is some kind of driver or a momentum with this society. But what is fragile over time is the ability to sustain this change. And that's actually what I'm going to address in terms of the today's thing. I'm going to talk about a hidden issue that nobody talks about during the rebuild, reform, or growth within the country. And this hidden plague, I would say, is that whenever you're having a new time when very bold decisions need to be made and to accelerate a certain growth or verticals and priorities within the state, often what happens is this kind of disconnect between the government and the citizens. So you always have this kind of leading institutional changes, or like the leadership that runs up front, but you have the kind of gap growing within the citizens, because most of the time they're not able to internalize those changes within the social fabric of everyday living. And I think that's a huge problem. And there's like tons of like real world experiences. Uh, take if you take, for example, like Georgia or any post-Soviet country, wherever there was this successful reform of a certain vertical, not many of them proved to be sustainable, and the leaders and the people driving this change have always been kind of alienated after a certain point. I always consider this process to be something similar to a startup building, because when you're working on a startup and these ideas and priorities change and you're trying to pivot fast, right? If the communication is not coherent, the process breaks down. So community does not understand you, your team members, you start to lose the interest, and those transitions are super important. And for those transitions to happen successfully, I think the very important layer is in terms of how do we design this trust between the change and between the stakeholders and civilians of the society. So in a way, in a Ukrainian scene, a rebuild does not mean a rebuild of an infrastructure, but it means as well primary a rebuild of a relationship between the change drivers and the participants in the form of society. And when we talk about the trust, which is an important aspect, right? Without the trust in tools and format of this relationship between these two sides, nothing's going to work. So in terms of trust, the neutrality of systems is very important. So it only works when no one is control and no one is able to manipulate it. The open source movements that are blockchain based, right? Or this kind of distributed ledgers, they are audited by everyone. Was this kind of reshapement of a distributed network systems that can give birth to trust that is shared by all the stakeholders at the same time, and it's not questioned. So in a way, I believe a rebuild of the relationship should be built on these kind of neutral systems and shared infrastructures that are maintained by all sides. And I think this aspect especially matters when we talk about this kind of current world, right? And especially in a digital world. What it really showed us that trust or like reality is not the same thing at the same time. So whenever you have a division within the society or disagreement, what actually happens that discussion about what we trust, what unites us, what are the principles that we agree on, they completely vanish, and we're left in this kind of algorithmic echo chambers that bring more discourse and widening of these different gaps over time. And in a way, thinking how can we resolve this division, right? So division often is not resolved by opinions, uh, but unfortunately, it's resolved by the control mechanism, who controls the narrative, whose narrative is louder, and it never really gives us the ability to arrive to something meaningful and workable. So when I'm asked like how can we build trust and what are the instruments of building this relationship, I always refer to the mass. And in a way, I believe that math and participation and the common rules are the most important aspects within the society. So after blockchains, if you ask me, what are the next frontier that we can unlock within the society, I always say that it's about the participation and these new governance systems that should accompany any type of change within the society to make the process sustainable. So when I talk about this participation, I mean the systems that civilians can use to participate into decision making, right? And there's one distinction. I know, like, how can citizens participate? And we've seen like these different use cases, right? So I don't know, like petitions or like the protests or like the signatures and stuff. But there's a clear distinction in the systems that I vouch for with the previous use cases, because previously, if you had this kind of a petition system, nothing in this participation was self-enforceable, right? So it never had an enforceable outlook. So you could gather all the signatures of the civilians, or you could like gather all these kind of campaigns around it, but default, it never meant that something would happen, and that's the missing point of the previous engagement versus the engagement that I'm going to talk about. So I believe that if we're going to involve more citizens into a decision making, it would always need to lead to a kind of default enforceable outcome. So the use cases could be like the people writing petition with enforceable outcomes, such as like causing the digital vetoes of a certain incentives, or like pauses for a particular incentives, or more importantly, on a local level or a national level, it's about the kind of priority measurement. So being able to ask the civilians of a certain group or the stakeholders of a certain project to understand what these priorities are, and most importantly, like engage them not only from like the measuring sentiment, but in terms of like enforcing once again, right? So they should have a right to recall the certain incentives, or like put like a red button in terms of like stopping a certain reform, or an incentive that does not look uh, nice, or like there's a kind of information gap around that. So I'm talking about this text that is less of an utopia, or like this kind of recommendation, to something that is enforceable and can provide this kind of digital checks and balances in a modern society, right? So why not give civilians a threshold, like this kind of constitutional majority that can recall certain people, right? And the ones that were elected in a certain office, and not wait these kind of huge cycles and polarization to happen early on, right? And when I talk about this kind of engagement of civilians into this process, I don't mean it as a kind of anti-government mechanism, or this something that works outside of the constitution, right? Modern, sorry, participate.
Lasha, we cannot hear you. Lasha?
Am I back? I should be back now.
Yeah, now we hear you. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I always have this problem with my mic. But yeah, I guess like I was talking about using this instrument not as an anti-government measure, but more like this kind of early signal detection and the part of the checks and balances of the modern democracies can have. And actually, the cool part, like why these participatory things were not possible before, is that until blockchain, we actually never had the capability to build these kind of credibly neutral infrastructures. So in a way, you can consider the moment we live in and the maturity of this technology kind of well aligned to express and like implement these new toolings within this society. And we have at least like 15 years old experience how blockchains redefine this trust and participation within this finance, right? Where we disintermediated the market and created this shared common ground of value exchange. And I do believe that now the ones that are bold and next experiments taking on with this technology is applying it exactly to these civilians and who we are as a part of this community, and implement it into a larger governance, everyday governance of the systems. I'm going to switch like what do we need for that, more like on the technical side, and what we already have. So for such systems to work with a push of a button from a mobile phone, you actually need like two ingredients, which is the kind of digital identity and the ability to allow citizens to conduct this participation in a completely private, preserving way without any coercion from any part of the world. And on the other hand, this kind of blockchain ledgers and infrastructures where we share these opinions and mix it up, and everyone is able to audit and see what the results are. So it's a kind of a common truth detection mechanism that is not run by government, but that it runs in parallel by this kind of civil society, as you can imagine. And the cool part about the Ukraine is that Ukraine, especially in the last years, it has excelled tremendously into digitalizing all the services. And we all have the DIA app and the ability, like the one of the first versions of digital identities. They are distributed at a scale that no other country has done so far. But once again, I do know that you can like vote for like a song or something today, but for a larger participation, I don't think that this functionality should be built within this kind of state format, but we should anchor all this identity infrastructure to a kind of neutral infrastructures, such as blockchains can provide. And in recent years, our team has been experimenting in that direction. So we launched a pretty neutral, it's a kind of public good open source project called freedom2.org that provides this tooling that I was talking about, how any citizen holding a passport or national ID can just take a phone, tap it on, provide this privacy of by processing all the information on a mobile phone without sharing any data, and then using this beauty of cryptography, being able to participate in governance, voting, polling, digital protests in different formats, right? But guaranteeing the validity of a full interaction. So we ran an early pilots into more like the kind of digital activism, where civilians of a certain nation, they would take a passport, they would tap it on, they would prove that they're over 18 and the citizens of a certain country, and then by scanning the QR code somewhere on YouTube or anywhere they got it, they would show their consent, so that they were able to leave their mark and voice in a pretty open system. We had like 3 trials run in Russia with oppositioners, Georgia as well with opposition groups, and some Iranian activists as well. So these were like these kind of early digital versions of finding these alternative parallel systems where participations from civilians that don't trust or they don't like certain things within the government can be expressed freely and without the fear of prosecution or dependency of on a state infrastructure. And that's why I always talk about this kind of neutrality of such instruments, because it could be used by both sides, the ones that are in power and ones that are not in power. So it's a kind of a neutral field where two sides can meet. And why it matters on both sides is that I believe that like early participation and early signaling, whether it's like reform, prioritization of where the money should be spent, or me disliking a certain person that lied to us during the election campaigns, and having this enforceable tooling will actually decrease polarization on both sides. Because if you have an early signals and if you're like wise enough, both on the state or the civilian movement time, you always have this kind of field of resolution. And that's what matters, right? Especially in today's world. So in a way, this kind of shared consensus mechanisms that run in parallel for civilian societies through total transparency and auditability is this, I think, this a missing piece within the modern democracies. And I believe that like this is the kind of step we everyone should take going forward, especially when we're dealing with swings from the reform perspective. And most importantly, those systems, once again, I'll say, should be credibly neutral, like blockchains, because participation without the fear of surveillance or coercion is what builds the trust in such systems. So I don't believe in governments or like even the third organizations and agencies running those systems. So it should be like supported by state. It should be guaranteed by constitution in an ideal scenario from an outcome perspective, but they should remain credibly neutral. And in a way, I might be like high hoping as usual because of my kind of optimism in the stuff, but I believe that like, especially in this polarized world and this digital echo chambers that I mentioned in terms of the social media and stuff, like turning friction into a constructive and enforceable instruments is super important, not only for reforms, but once again, it's about like driving change that could be sustainable or early on kind of reversible certain things that does not really work or align with the society needs, right? So I believe that next frontier is this governance upgrade, and it can become a fundamental part of the democracies as we know from a checks and balances perspective, you know? And in a way, Ukraine has always been positioned into this kind of a front runner, you know? There's always a challenge within the Ukraine of like, I don't know, the different things, especially now war. But when the time comes, I believe that this country and the people there are like have more than enough skills and kind of willpower to jump ahead of everything. And I hope that like the moves for the rebuild, they're gonna be bold, but bold in terms of like including everyone and working towards and like course correcting the certain things together. And that's where these neutral infrastructures and blockchains can truly work. So that's it. Do we have like a QA or how that works?
Yeah, Lasha, thank you for for the great presentation. Yeah, when the questions are asked, I put them on the screen and read, but for now there are no questions. But let's wait. We have like 40 people watching us. Maybe there will be questions. And I would like to ask, it is a very noble initiative, especially right now in the given world environment where we can see like, there is a clash of freedom and, and the oppressors of freedom in different parts of the globe. What are the best ways for people to participate in the project you presented and maybe get in touch with you, or how to get engaged?
I mean, they can get in touch with us or go to freedomtool.org. Everything we've built in terms of the tooling, it's open source. So different parties, different stakeholders of different political views are using it for their own purposes, but the principle there is always same. So even them, they can't design the system to harm. It's always kind of open participation, like this kind of permissionless governance mechanism that any holder of a passport or any person can use and participate. So
okay, understood. Well, I don't see any other questions being asked, but there could be other, people can maybe reach out to you, and then probably they will follow up with this. That's how should such projects receive their funding?
It's an interesting question, right? So what is there to fund? So there's like two aspects. One is using funds for pooling the infrastructure, right? So fortunately, blockchains as a decentralized network infrastructure with the smart contracts where all this logic of authentication, registering voters, civilians, running the logic, it already exists. So there's no like burden in terms of like running this server or something. You can deploy a smart contract that is open source and off it goes, right? So it's about the kind of technical skills. And on top of it, I was actually benchmarking, like how much does a single vote costs for an initiator? And on I don't know, pretty standard, well-known layer one blockchains, the cost of single vote is 0.003 cents. If you benchmark that to running any poll or I don't know, I'm not even talking about elections. The average cost, because of this kind of physical preparatory and those stuff, varies around $9 to $10, at least in US. So this infrastructure and these credibly neutral blockchains are not only giving these trust anchors, but they actually are diminishing a lot of costs and distribution headaches with such systems. So I believe that these projects are not that hard to fund, and because it does not really require that much. What it requires is this kind of bold moves, understanding, and inclusion into the fabrics of democracy, which is a much bigger friction than sustaining such kind of infrastructure to this day.
All right, understood. Thank you for answer. So it seems we are out of the questions. So Lasha, thank you for the great presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of the cases for, there is already a lot of the cases for this, and I'm sure there will be a lot of the cases for this in the future of Ukraine and reconstruction of Ukraine in particular. Yeah, thank you for joining us and sharing your experience.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, have a great day.